I never thought the road back to that stretch of land would feel heavy in my chest, but the moment the hills opened up and the bare vines began rising on both sides of the asphalt, something inside me tightened like a rope pulled too fast. That place was supposed to be steady ground, the sort of soil where memories stayed where you left them. It was where the man who raised me once handed me a pruning knife and said, "Patience is not something you talk about, it's something you practice until the earth believes you." I spent half my childhood running along those rows, learning when to wait and when to cut, when to trust the sun, when to give in to the frost. I had imagined bringing my grandkids here someday, watching them learn the same small truths in the same dirt. I never expected to be driving toward it, with my pulse thudding hard enough to feel in my teeth. It started the morning I got the call from the kid who'd grown into someone sharper than I ever managed to be. His voice had that clipped edge he only used when something was wrong, and when he told me to go to the Vineyard, early, privately, quietly, not to warn anyone, the old instincts from decades in a job full of burned walls and collapsing staircases kicked back to life. I left before I even had time to let the coffee finish brewing. The highway stretched for hours, but none of it calmed me the way it used to. It felt like the road was shrinking under the weight of whatever I wasn't supposed to know yet. I kept thinking about the last time I'd seen the old man 2 months earlier, how his steps were firm, how he'd talked about pruning like it was an equation only he understood, how his hands hadn't trembled when he lifted a glass to the sunlight to check clarity. People his age slowed, sure, but he hadn't been slipping, not even close. I held on to that thought like a handrail, because the kid's tone had dug into something cold inside me. By the time I turned off the highway and followed the twisting road toward the house, the sun was low and thin, a pale gold scraping across the bare branches. It should have felt peaceful. Winter always made the Vineyard quiet in a way that reminded me of deep sleep, not danger. But the silence felt wrong before I even stepped out of the truck. The first sign was the unfamiliar car parked close to the house, shiny and new, the kind of vehicle people buy to be seen in. The old man didn't keep company with people like that. The second sign was that I found myself parking behind the barn instead of in the driveway. It wasn't intentional at first, but somewhere in me, the training of decades whispered, "Don't announce yourself." I took out my phone, pressed record, tucked it into my shirt so it could hear what I might not be able to repeat later. The sky smelled like cold soil and old vines as I approached the house. I reached for the door expecting resistance, but it opened with a soft click. Unlocked. Wrong. The old man believed in locking doors even when there were workers all over the place. I stepped into a chill that didn't belong to the season. The thermostat glowed a number he would never have chosen. The air felt uninhabited, like someone had been stripping the house of its warmth on purpose. My boots sounded too loud on the wood floor as I moved past the living room. A stack of mail lay scattered across the table, unopened, untouched. He never left bills or letters lying like that. He treated mail like one more duty to complete before sundown. My pulse crawled higher. Something wasn't right. I called out softly, expecting at least a grumble or a cough. Nothing answered. A strange stillness pressed against the walls, a kind I hadn't felt since walking into houses where the smoke had cleared but the danger hadn't. I stayed quiet and followed the low murmur of voices drifting from the hall, voices I recognized and didn't want to hear. I moved toward the office, and through the sliver of the half-open door, I saw her sitting where the old man should have been. My sibling looked perfectly composed, hair pulled back, hands moving across paperwork that wasn't hers to handle. She wasn't alone. Beside her sat a man who wore his wealth like a uniform, pointing at something on the screen and speaking in a voice that made my skin crawl even though the words hadn't yet landed. I eased closer until their conversation sharpened enough to understand. That's when the walls inside me seemed to tilt. They were talking numbers, liquidation, timelines, evaluations of land and assets, as if they were reading a shopping list. Then came the phrase that made something clench around my ribs. Memory care. They spoke of the old man like he was already lost, like he couldn't tell the difference between morning and night. They spoke of moving him somewhere far away, somewhere controlled, somewhere locked. They talked about selling the Vineyard before Christmas. They talked about commissions, payouts, actuarial tables, how long he would live. They talked about him like he was a burden that needed to be lifted from their shoulders and carried off to a place where no one could hear him protest. My nails dug into my palm as the man explained how a piece of paper signed months ago gave them power over everything the old man had ever built. My sibling nodded with the kind of eagerness people show when they've already begun spending money they don't have yet. Then came the part that made the edges of my vision pulse. According to the man beside her, the old man had been diagnosed with moderate dementia. There were medical records, evaluations, a doctor's name I'd never heard in my life. My sibling talked about how I'd fight it, but she'd win. That once the contracts were signed, everything would move quickly. She'd already confirmed a buyer. They'd have everything finalized before the holiday. They spoke of him as though he were cargo. They spoke of me like an inconvenience. I felt the recording in my pocket capturing every word. For a moment, I wanted to walk away, call the kid, handle it like a case, keep everything clean and quiet. But then I thought about the old man's hands steady on the vines, thought about him teaching me how to read the soil before reading people, thought about the way he'd said last fall that he wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. And something in me snapped. I pushed the door open. The look on my sibling's face when she saw me should have told me everything, even if I hadn't heard a single word before. A flicker of panic, then calculation, then that same brittle superiority from childhood, the one that always tried to make me feel smaller. The man next to her shifted like someone ready to step into a role he'd practiced. He introduced himself like this was some benign meeting, offering a handshake he should have known better than to expect. I didn't touch him. I just asked where the old man was. My sibling acted as though I was overreacting, said he was tired, said confusion was normal now, said I needed to accept things. I looked around the office, the files, the contracts, the lies. My voice felt tight when I demanded to see him. She hesitated. For a second, I thought she would refuse. But she led me down the hall, and the whole time, my pulse wouldn't slow. The room where he rested felt like a cave instead of a bedroom. Curtains closed, air stale, light dim. I crossed to the bed in 2 steps. What I saw made my stomach drop. The old man's eyes fluttered as though waking through layers of fog. His voice was thick, his words slow, his pupils too wide. The weight of what they'd been doing hit me in one hard blow. I turned to demand an explanation, but the excuses started pouring out before I even spoke. Something inside me hardened in a way I hadn't felt since dragging people out of burning stairwells. This wasn't exhaustion. This wasn't age. This was chemical. This was deliberate. I picked up the medicine bottles. I read the labels. 2 of them weren't for sleep. They were for sedation. Heavy sedation. The kind that could turn the sharpest mind into mush. I looked at my sibling, and in that moment, the last shreds of whatever bond we'd had twisted into something I didn't have a name for. She tried to insist it was necessary, said the old man was dangerous, said he was declining, said the doctor recommended it. My voice didn't shake when I asked why the doctor on the bottles wasn't the one the old man had trusted for years. She froze just long enough for the truth to bleed through. I walked out of the room and told her to leave. She didn't listen. The man tried to interrupt. That's when I told them I'd been recording since before I opened the door. The color drained from their faces. My sibling's voice cracked when she told me not to call the authorities. The man's composure snapped when he realized this wasn't a family argument, it was a crime scene. I felt my hand tighten around the phone. For a second, the house felt too bright, too sharp, like every lie in it had been waiting for this moment. I told them both to get out. They left. Tires screeched across the gravel. The silence that followed felt like the house taking its first breath in weeks. I went back to the old man's bedside and sat. His breathing was uneven but steady enough. His fingers twitched when I touched his arm. The fog in his eyes made the anger rise in my throat until it almost burned. That's how the first step of all this began, not with shouting, not with some dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet room, a sedated man, and the realization that someone I'd grown up with had chosen money over blood. I stayed beside him until the sky outside shifted toward evening, and with every minute that passed, the resolve inside me sharpened. Whatever they thought they were going to take from him, from us, from everything that place meant, they weren't going to touch any of it again. They had tried to bury him in chemicals and paperwork, but they'd forgotten something the old man had taught me long before adulthood. Roots go deeper than people think, and mine had just woken up. I stood there a long moment, letting the cold of the house sink into my skin until it felt like the walls were pressing in around me. Because the deeper I walked into those rooms, the more everything looked staged and wrong, like someone had been arranging pieces of a life without understanding the person who lived it, and that wrongness kept tightening around my ribs. The old man sleeping heavily in the back room wasn't the man I had walked the vines with 2 months earlier, and every breath he took sounded slow and dragged like someone had pushed him underwater and forgotten to let him come up. I tried to steady myself, but instead felt the heat rise slowly in my chest, the kind that comes when you realize someone you trusted had turned your life into a script they were directing behind your back. I went back to the office, and the desk felt colder than the rest of the room, like all the plans they'd laid out still lingered in the wood, and the papers scattered across the surface looked like evidence of a crime they'd stopped caring to hide because they believed the old man was too far gone to notice, and that I would never show up early enough to interrupt whatever they were constructing. I scanned the documents again, paying attention to details I missed earlier, because anger can make your eyes skip, and now that my pulse had settled into a slow throb, I could see the layers of deceit woven through every page. Medical evaluations with dates that didn't match the timeline of the old man's last doctor visits, symptoms described in phrases that sounded memorized and repeated, signatures too clean to belong to someone who shook ever so slightly when he wrote his name, and yet these signatures tried to imitate him, but without the pressure he used when he pressed the pen into the paper. I picked up one sheet and held it up to the light, remembering how his handwriting always curled at the ends and never sat perfectly straight, because he wrote the way he worked, with the vines, slow and uneven, but precise. And these papers were too neat, too calculated, too sharp. The more I read, the more something inside me twisted, not just in anger, but in fear, because this wasn't improvisation. This had been planned long before I arrived. My sibling and the man in the suit had crafted a narrative of decline and incompetence, built on fake doctor visits, forged documents and medications, strong enough to quiet a person's ability to question what was happening to him. I moved through the room with my phone still recording, though I no longer needed the reminder, because the shaking in my hands wasn't from fear, but from the realization that I had been away too long, trusting phone calls that told me everything was fine while the old man was slowly being erased. As I walked into the hallway, the silence felt heavier, like it was listening to me, and the floor creaked in ways it never had before, as if the house itself was reacting to what had been done inside it. I turned toward the kitchen because something in the pit of my stomach told me to check the things that didn't look wrong at first glance. The refrigerator hummed quietly when I opened it, and rows of neatly arranged containers stared back at me, labeled with dates written in handwriting that used to bring comfort but now felt like a threat because the meals hadn't been touched. He hadn't eaten what she brought him. The old man must have been too sedated to get up on his own, too tired to warm anything, too confused to trust the taste, and the realization made my throat tighten. The pantry shelves were nearly bare except for a few cans and stale snacks, which meant he had been living off whatever scraps he could manage, while she brought food only for appearance. I touched one of the containers and felt the cold seep into my fingertips, as if I were touching the truth she had been hiding. I closed the refrigerator slowly and moved to the sink, where dried streaks of something that looked like spilled tea, or maybe medication, clung to the porcelain surface. The old man's cup sat beside it, still damp inside. I lifted it and smelled something faintly sweet, something that didn't belong in tea, something that didn't belong in anything meant to keep someone healthy. My breath hitched, and for a moment I had to grip the counter because my vision blurred with a mix of anger and disbelief. How many nights had he swallowed whatever she handed him, trusting her because she was blood, because she was someone he had once held as a baby, because betrayal isn't something you see coming until it's already wrapped around your throat. I stepped away from the counter because I needed space to think, and the living room offered no comfort. His favorite chair sat near the window, and the blanket draped across it smelled like detergent instead of him, which meant someone else had washed it, probably to erase any trace of the moments he might have been awake long enough to realize something was wrong. On the coffee table, his book was open, but the page wasn't where he would have left it, because he never lost track of what he read, and if he ever did, he'd tuck the bookmark carefully at the correct chapter. Seeing it wrong felt like a small wound. It meant he had been too sedated to read or mark his place or even remember he had been reading at all. The house around me suddenly felt like a cage built from familiar objects arranged by unfamiliar hands, and each step I took made the air thicker, like I was sinking deeper into water. I went to the front door and checked the lock again, remembering how it had been unlocked when I arrived, and knowing the old man would never leave it that way. My sibling must have been here often enough to feel safe leaving it open. I walked toward the back of the house, feeling something rising in me again like heat beneath my ribs, and when I entered the bathroom, I caught sight of the cabinet partly open. Inside were bottles of medication, lined up in neat rows, but only one matched something I recognized. The others were sedatives and antipsychotics strong enough to quiet a person into vacancy. I held one bottle and listened to the sound of pills tapping against the plastic as I tilted it. Too many. Far too many for the schedule written on the label. It meant she had been giving him more than prescribed and lying about how much he took. My stomach twisted again, this time with something sharper. I placed the bottle back and shut the cabinet, wanting to slam it but not wanting to wake him. Every step back to his room felt heavier, and when I opened the door again he was still asleep. Mouth slightly parted, chest rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths that didn't match the man I knew. I sat beside him and watched his eyelids flutter as though he were trying to break through a fog, but couldn't breathe enough to wake fully. I reached for his hand and felt how cold his skin was, and I realized he had been cold for days, maybe weeks, because she had turned the thermostat down to make it appear like he was neglecting himself. I swallowed hard and forced myself to focus because I could not fall apart beside him. I whispered that I was there, that he wasn't alone, that whatever they had tried to do was over now. His fingers twitched weakly in response, and the faint motion nearly broke me. I stayed with him until his breathing settled again, then stood because I wasn't done. There was more to uncover. I checked the drawers of his nightstand next, finding stray pills, crumbs of something crushed into powder, and a half-empty bottle of water. He must have taken the pills she pushed on him, then fallen asleep before finishing the water. My hands shook as I cleaned the mess because it felt like erasing evidence of suffering, and I hated the feeling, but I hated leaving it there even more. When I stepped back into the hallway, the air felt like it pressed into my chest, making it hard to breathe. I went to the back door and pushed it open, letting the cold outside air rush in because I needed a breath that didn't taste like lies. The vineyard stretched out toward the fading light, rows of bare vines, casting long shadows across the soil, and seeing it like that made something inside me tighten again. This land had been his entire life, and someone he trusted had tried to turn it into a bargaining chip. I looked back at the house, at the windows darkened by closed curtains, and felt a heaviness settle inside me. Someone had tried to bury the old man in silence and drugs, hoping the vineyard would fall into their hands without a fight. I took another breath and whispered that they had chosen the wrong family, because I wasn't going to let him fade into a haze he didn't choose, and I wasn't going to let his legacy become currency in someone else's desperation. And in that moment, standing in the cold air with the vines reaching toward the dim sky, I felt the weight of everything shift inside me, not like fear but like resolve, settling deep into the marrow of my bones. I stood in the hallway long enough for the cold to sit on my skin like a second layer, because the next steps mattered, and I knew walking back into the office meant facing the truth without anything softening the blow. The house felt like it was holding its breath, watching me move toward that doorway again, and a part of me wished I could pretend none of it had happened, pretend I had imagined their voices, pretend the old man was just asleep from a long day of work. But I had seen too much to pretend. I pushed the door fully open, and the room smelled faintly of cologne left in the air by the man who had sat beside my sibling while discussing the details of how to carve up the life my father had built. I could almost hear their voices echoing as if the walls had memorized every word. My pulse jumped as I stepped inside because I knew what I had to do next, even if I didn't feel ready for it. I walked to the desk and stared at the chair where she had been sitting only an hour earlier, and something inside me twisted at the memory of her smile when she talked about the money she would receive once everything was sold, as if a life's work could be converted into digits without guilt touching her at all. The man beside her had spoken calmly, as if explaining a financial plan instead of participating in slowly dismantling a family. I leaned forward, letting my fingers brush the edge of the desk, and said their words back to myself slowly so they would settle fully into me. Then I turned and headed toward the old man's room again, because there was something I hadn't done yet, something I had been avoiding since the moment I first saw him lying beneath those heavy curtains. When I entered, he was still in that fog, blinking slowly as if trying to climb out of his own head. I sat down beside him and touched his shoulder, hoping he would feel the warmth in my hand and follow it back to me. His eyelids fluttered, and after a moment, he managed a small sound, not quite a word, but enough to let me know he heard me. I breathed his name softly and watched awareness flicker behind his eyes, like a dim light, trying to stay alive in the wind. It was then I understood how deep the drugs ran in his system and how long he had been fighting them alone. I told him again that I was there, that he was safe now, that no one was going to decide anything for him without me in the room. His fingers moved slightly, and I could almost believe he was trying to squeeze my hand even if his muscles couldn't follow through. I stayed with him until his breathing steadied, and that gave me just enough strength to do what I had avoided since discovering him. I needed answers. I needed truth, no matter how ugly. I stepped into the hallway and called out loudly enough to be heard throughout the house, even though I knew the two of them were gone. The sound came out harder than I intended, as if I had been holding it in my chest for weeks. I moved to the front of the house, opened the door and stepped outside, looking toward the driveway, half expecting to see the car return, but the gravel sat untouched, the silence stretching across the property like a warning. The air felt heavy and my heartbeat thudded in my ears, as if my body already knew what I had to do next. I went back inside, pulled out my phone and scrolled to the kid's number. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from the weight of finally confronting everything at once. When he answered, his voice sounded tight, like he had been waiting for my call, even though he did not know exactly what I had walked into. I told him everything I had seen, everything I had heard, everything they had said behind that half-open door. Each detail he repeated back to me in a whisper, as if confirming the pieces he already had. When I explained the medications, when I told him about the forged documents, when I described the old man barely conscious, his voice went quiet in a way that meant he had switched into investigator mode. He asked if I had recorded it all, and when I said yes, there was a long silence, then a soft exhale that carried something like relief and anger blended into one. He told me not to let anyone back inside, including the woman who shared blood with me, because she had crossed a line we could not allow her to return from. He said he had been tracing suspicious transfers and irregular activity for weeks, and that everything I had found fit exactly into the pattern he had built. He told me to check the old man's accounts because someone had been trying to drain small amounts regularly, and that those amounts almost always precede mass liquidation. His certainty hit me like a blow. I thanked him without realizing I had said the words out loud, then ended the call knowing what I had to do next. I walked back into the office and turned on the computer. My hands hovered above the keyboard because for a moment the idea of logging into something the old man trusted felt like crossing a boundary, but then I remembered the unopened mail, the cold house, the sedated man in the back room, and my hesitation turned into resolve. I entered his passwords, the ones he had trusted me with years ago when he told me someone in the family should know how to reach his accounts in an emergency. I guess he had seen more clearly than I had. When the screen loaded and the financial statements appeared, I felt my throat tighten. Transactions he would never have made sat scattered through the accounts. Withdrawals that looked small on their own but together formed a pattern, someone trying to siphon without drawing attention. I checked the emails next, finding messages from supposed doctors, messages from clinics with names I had never heard, messages confirming appointments he had never told me about, messages written in a tone that felt wrong because they spoke of decline and confusion and cognitive issues that did not match the sharp man I had seen only weeks before. My chest tightened so hard it hurt. I leaned back, trying to breathe through the pressure because I knew what these messages meant. Someone had filed these as proof, someone had used them to convince others that he needed help, someone had written a story about him that wasn't real, and they had almost succeeded in making it real by drugging him until he fit the lie. I closed the computer gently because the anger building in me felt dangerous, and I needed my mind clear for what came next. I walked back into the hallway and headed toward the old man's room again, but stopped halfway because I heard something faint inside me. Maybe memory, maybe instinct telling me to check the window. I went to it and pulled the curtain aside just enough to see the long road leading to the house. The sun was lowering, casting an orange glow across the vines. A figure moved far down the road, too far to identify, but close enough that instinct made my pulse jump. I watched for a few tense seconds, then realized it was just someone walking a dog from the neighboring property. I let out a breath and closed the curtain again. The tension did not leave my shoulders, though. I returned to the old man's bedside and whispered that he was safe, that I would not leave him. And as I spoke, he blinked slowly and tried to lift his hand again, but the weight of the drugs was still too strong. I placed my hand over his and promised him quietly that what they had tried to do would not stand, that the land he had protected for more than 4 decades would not be stolen from him while he was too weak to defend himself. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, listening to the soft rasp of his breathing until I felt something cold settle into the center of my chest, a kind of clarity that arrives when there is no more room for doubt. Then I stood and went back into the hallway because I knew the confrontation was coming, and I needed to be ready. I needed to gather every piece of truth, every scrap of evidence, every detail they thought would stay hidden. Because when the moment came, when she returned pretending concern, pretending innocence, pretending to be the dutiful child she had not been for years, I would look her in the eyes and peel away every lie until she was forced to stand in the wreckage she had created. And in the quiet of that hallway, with the house dark around me and the old man breathing behind the closed door, I understood something with absolute certainty. That confrontation would not end softly, and I was no longer afraid of that. The night felt too still for a place that had held so much life for so many years, and the silence pressed on me in a way that made every breath feel heavier. I moved through the house, switching lights on one by one, partly to see what I was doing, partly to convince myself I wasn't standing in a trap someone else had set. I kept thinking about the moment she smiled in the office, the way her eyes lit at the mention of $500,000, and the sick certainty that she had rehearsed that smile long before she ever walked into this house with her advisor. I replayed every word they said as I moved room to room, collecting anything that might matter later: envelopes, receipts, papers tucked under stacks of old newsletters. The old man had always kept things organized, but someone had been rearranging his world, reshaping it to fit the story they needed. And the quiet disorder I found felt intentional, like a thief trying to mimic chaos, so no one noticed what was missing. I found the thermostat again, set to a cold that didn't belong in winter, in a home where warmth had always been part of the ritual. I reset it and stood there for a moment, listening as the heat kicked on with a soft hum, and somehow that sound alone made me feel like the house was finally waking up after weeks of being held under by something heavy. I walked into the kitchen and pulled out a notebook the old man kept near the door, where he used to jot down reminders, harvest dates, grocery lists, calls to return. I flipped through it, page after page of tidy handwriting, and the more I looked, the more my stomach tightened, because the last entries weren't his. His writing was sharp, confident even at his age, but these notes looked clumsy, stiff, like someone trying to copy a shape without understanding how the hand moved. Short reminders written in phrases he'd never use, notes blaming forgetfulness moments framed as accidents. I put the notebook aside, feeling the air change around me, as if the house itself had been trying to tell me something, and now that I was finally listening, it had more to say. I moved through the hallway, picking up the bills she'd hidden, the ones she thought I wouldn't notice, but I had been raised by the man who taught me to check every lock twice, every fence post 3 times during storm season. Details mattered to him, so they mattered to me too. When the pile of papers grew high, I carried them to the dining table and began sorting them, even though my hands were trembling because I needed to understand the pattern before morning. I kept hearing the kid's voice replaying in my head, telling me that she had been moving pieces quietly, that she had been shifting money out of reach, that she had been building the foundation for a takeover long before any of us noticed that pressure. I took a breath and started sorting by date, each paper sliding into a line that slowly revealed its own terrible truth. Transfers she initiated without permission, withdrawals crafted to seem small, sudden changes to accounts that had been steady for decades. She had been preparing for this long before the drugs, long before the forged documents, long before she walked in, pretending to be a dutiful daughter here to help. I felt the weight of betrayal settle into my chest, but I forced myself to keep going because I wasn't done and morning was coming quickly. I checked the locks on every door, something my body did automatically after a lifetime of running into danger and finding comfort in routine. The back door was slightly cracked open, as if someone had left quickly or returned quietly, and I stood there staring at the gap, unable to tell which possibility made my skin crawl more. I closed it firmly and pushed the bolt into place until it clicked, echoing through the house. Then I walked to the old man's room and stood by the door, listening to his breathing, making sure it stayed steady now that the drugs were slowly fading. He stirred once, and I waited until he settled again before walking back to the living room. I sat in his old armchair, the one he always used when reading harvest reports and planning for spring. It felt wrong to sit there, but I needed to understand this house the way he had before everything was poisoned. I leaned my head back, closed my eyes for a moment, and forced myself to breathe in the scent of wood smoke and old paper and faint traces of wine soaked into the grain of the floors. That was when I heard it, a sound so small it could have been nothing, but my mind caught it instantly, the soft crunch of gravel outside. My eyes opened and every muscle in me tightened. I stood quietly, walked to the window, pulled the curtain back just enough to see. A pair of headlights was creeping up the long road to the house, moving slowly, as if trying not to draw attention, yet the darkness made the lights impossible to hide. My pulse climbed so fast I had to steady my breathing just to keep my hands from shaking. The car stopped halfway up the drive, and the engine cut off, leaving only the sound of crickets and the wind through dormant vines. I stepped away from the window, moving into the shadow of the hallway because instinct told me not to stand where I could be seen. My mind raced, trying to guess who it could be. Not the kid. He would have texted first. Not the old man's neighbors. They didn't come unannounced this late. So that left only one possibility, and my jaw clenched at the thought of her returning. I waited, listening for footsteps, but the silence stretched out far too long. Finally, I heard it, a slow crunch, then another, like someone walking up the path without rushing, without fear. My body moved before I even decided what to do. I stepped back into the hallway, grabbed the old fire iron leaning near the fireplace, because it was the only thing heavy enough to feel useful, and kept myself hidden by the wall while the footsteps approached the porch. A shadow moved across the frosted glass of the front door, and I felt my pulse hammer against my ribs. A soft knock followed, and a familiar voice called out, pretending concern, pretending innocence, pretending she hadn't been discussing how to dismantle our lives only hours earlier. I didn't respond. I let the silence stretch until she knocked again, harder this time, her voice rising with annoyance instead of worry. She called my name, then the old man's name, said she had forgotten something important, said she needed to talk. I stepped closer, but not close enough for her to hear my breath, and waited. After a few moments, she stopped knocking. The quiet that followed felt worse than the knocking. A second later, I heard the click of the doorknob, testing to see if it would turn. Her voice changed, then low, irritated, frustrated, when she realized the house was locked tight. She muttered something I couldn't make out. Then the sound of footsteps going down the porch, steps slow, heavy, uncertain. I waited until the sound faded before checking the window again, but the path was empty, the car gone as quietly as it had come. I stayed there in the dark, staring at the empty road, realizing she hadn't come to talk. She had come to finish something she wasn't ready to let go of. That thought hit me so hard I felt dizzy. I stood in the dark, gripping the fire iron until my fingers ached, and understood that this wasn't over. She hadn't given up. She wouldn't give up. Not with that kind of debt pressing on her, not with her future already cracking under the weight of her choices. I walked back to the old man's door and listened again, making sure his breathing stayed steady and real. I whispered to him through the door that I wasn't going anywhere, that the house was locked, that no one would reach him tonight. Then I turned and walked back through the house, making sure every window was locked, every curtain closed, every document safely stacked for the kid and the investigators who would be here soon. The night dragged its way toward morning, and I didn't sleep, not even for a second, because the weight of what was coming pressed against my chest, and because I knew she would try again. People who had fallen that far didn't let go easily, and I wasn't going to let her take one more thing. Morning came in a slow grey crawl, like the sky was reluctant to touch the vineyard after everything that had happened, and I stood in the kitchen, watching the first thin lines of light slip across the counter while the old man stirred in, his room behind me. I felt like I had lived a year inside that single night, my mind replaying every detail of her face, the way she knocked, like someone testing the strength of a dying door, the way she lingered on the porch as if calculating her next move. By the time the sun lifted above the vines, I had checked the locks 3 times and walked through every hallway twice, just to make sure nothing had shifted while I wasn't looking. When the old man finally stepped out of his room, he looked clearer, more awake, the fog of the drugs thinning around him, until I could see the same sharp presence he had carried through every harvest season. He squinted toward the window, then looked at me with a mix of confusion and suspicion, as if he could sense danger even before I explained anything. I told him breakfast was ready, even though I had barely been able to eat a spoonful myself, and he sat slowly at the table, rubbing his eyes like someone waking from a long, unwanted dream. For a few minutes we ate in silence, the clink of dishes the only sound in the house, until he set his fork down and asked the question I had been waiting for since the moment he opened his eyes. "What happened?" His voice was soft but steady, and hearing it that way nearly broke me. I told him everything, the discoveries, the forged documents, the drugs slipped into his routine, the conversations. I recorded the secret plan to sell everything he had built while he was too sedated to speak for himself. I watched his face carefully as I talked, ready for shock or anger or heartbreak. But he simply listened quietly, his hands folded on the table the way he always did when dealing with storms or bad harvests, or things too heavy to fight all at once. When I finished, he sighed in a way that felt older than his years and asked if she had come back. I told him about the knocking, the way she said she needed to talk, the way she tried the doorknob, then left when she realized the house wouldn't let her in. He nodded slowly, eyes lowered as if he was trying to decide whether he had the strength to feel sadness for the child he once knew or rage for the stranger she had become. Before I could say anything else, I heard a car approaching, the crunch of tires on the gravel, but this time The sound didn't tighten my chest because I recognized the quick, firm rhythm of someone who wasn't hiding. The kid had arrived. I opened the door and he stepped in carrying a bag full of documents and that familiar determined expression he used on cases where truth had to be dug out of shadows. He hugged the old man briefly, careful but warm, then pulled me aside to update me quietly in a voice so controlled it made the air feel sharper. He had spent the night assembling everything, building timelines, linking names, tracing the flow of money through accounts that weren't supposed to be touched. He had assembled enough evidence to make any prosecutor look twice, and he had spoken with the authorities already. They were on their way. We moved into the living room, and I spread all the papers I had found across the table, while he added stacks of printed reports, screenshots, bank statements, and notes in his tight, precise handwriting. The old man watched us for a few moments, then joined us at the table, leaning forward slowly, like someone approaching a wound that needed tending. He scanned everything with surprising clarity, asking questions that cut straight through the confusion she had tried to build. Each answer seemed to steady him more, until I saw the man he had always been beneath the layers of sedatives she had forced on him. As we worked through the evidence, there was a knock on the door, a firm official knock, not hesitant, not threatening. Adult Protective Services arrived first, along with the deputy, and the kid explained everything from the beginning, while I added details, and the old man confirmed what he could. They asked him questions to test his awareness, and he answered every single one of them, clearly without hesitation, naming dates, naming people, naming tasks he had done, only days before she started filling his system with chemicals. The social worker listened, her eyes softening with each answer, then turned to me and asked if I felt safe here. I told her safety wasn't the issue. Justice was. She nodded, understanding the tone behind my words better than most would have. The deputy reviewed the recording I had made while the kid explained each voice, each statement, each admission they had given, so freely believing no one would ever hear. When the deputy finished listening, he sat back slowly, his jaw tightening in a way that told me he had seen enough cases to know exactly what this was. He asked the old man if he wanted to pursue charges. The old man looked at the vines outside the window for a long moment, then nodded once, with a quiet resolve that carried more weight than any shouted anger could. "Yes," he said with a steady voice. "I want to." The deputy left to initiate the warrant, and the house fell quiet again, the kind of quiet that feels like something waiting to break. The hours stretched long as we waited, each minute, feeling heavier than the last. The kid stayed close, double-checking his files, triple-checking the timeline, until the house felt like a breathing archive of every betrayal she had tried to hide. The old man rested in his chair but refused to lie down, saying he wanted to be awake when the moment came. I stood near the window watching the road, and each time a car passed, my pulse jumped. But none of them slowed, until one finally did, a dark sedan with county plates pulling slowly up the drive. The deputy stepped out along with two more officers, their presence quiet but solid, like the kind of reinforcement you hope arrives before anything slips out of control. They told us they had located her 30 minutes away. She had been at a gas station trying to withdraw cash from one of the old man's accounts, using a card she wasn't authorized to have. When she realized it was frozen, she panicked, locked herself in her car, and refused to get out until they threatened to break the window. Hearing that should have hurt, but it didn't. Something inside me had already burned away the part that wanted to believe she could come back from this. The deputy said she denied everything at first, then broke down when she learned about the recording. She insisted she had been trying to help, insisted she didn't understand, insisted the old man was confused. But when confronted with the forged documents, her excuses collapsed like a poorly built fence in storm winds. She was in custody waiting for processing, and they would contact us with updates. After the officers left, the house felt strangely empty, like a storm had passed, but the air hadn't figured it out yet. The old man sat heavily in his chair, looking tired but clearer than I had seen him since arriving. He asked if she had said anything. I told him only what the officers relayed. He nodded without speaking, and I could see something shifting in him, a slow reconciliation between the child he loved and the adult who had nearly destroyed him. He whispered that he didn't know where he went wrong, and the ache in his voice hit me harder than anything else that day. I told him he didn't fail her, that some people choose desperation over truth, that some people drown in their own fear and reach for anything, even if it means dragging others under. He listened quietly, then reached for my hand and held it firmly, in a way that reminded me of when I was young and scared, and he had always been the anchor, holding the world steady. By late afternoon, the kid had gone to file additional statements, and the social worker promised to return tomorrow to help restructure the old man's care and secure the house legally. When the sun began to sink over the vines, the old man and I sat together at the table, staring out at the land that had held our family for more than 4 decades. He said the vines looked tired this time of year, but still stubborn enough to survive another winter and another after that. He said resilience ran through the soil here and through the people who tended it. I didn't say anything, just watched the light fade across the fields, knowing everything would change again soon, but also knowing this time the change was something we would face together. When night finally fell, I checked the locks again out of habit, then returned to the living room, where the old man had already fallen asleep in his chair, his breathing slow, steady, and real. For the first time since arriving, I let myself sit quietly without scanning the windows, without checking the driveway, without waiting for footsteps that did not belong. The house felt warmer now, touched by truth instead of deception, and I could feel something inside me unclench, noticing a softness I had not allowed myself in days. But even as I sat there in the dim light, listening to the old man's breathing, I knew the story wasn't finished yet. Justice had begun, but the reckoning was still ahead. And when it came, I would be ready. The days that followed moved with a strange slowness, as if the world refused to return to its usual rhythm, and I found myself waking before sunrise every morning, listening for sounds that no longer came, sounds of footsteps that didn't belong, the quiet click of a door being tested, the sharp edge of a voice pretending concern. None of it came anymore, yet my body still reacted the way a firefighter's body reacts, long after the flames are gone, remembering danger even in the quiet. The old man sat at the table each morning with a clarity that returned in small, steady pieces, and every time he lifted his cup, I felt gratitude settle into me like soil, finally warming after a cold season. The kid visited, often bringing updates on the investigation, more documents, more statements, more proof that what she had done was not just panic or fear, but a carefully built plan that cracked open only because someone paid attention. The old man listened to every update with a quiet resignation, absorbing each detail, like someone studying the shape of a wound, not to reopen it, but to understand how deep it went. The prosecutor called on the third morning, explaining charges, counts, hearings, procedures, the kind of language that usually sounds distant and formal, but felt painfully personal when every word pointed back to the house I was standing. They said she had tried to shift blame, claimed she thought she was helping, claimed she believed the old man was losing himself, but the forged signatures, the fake tests, the sedatives hidden in teacups, told a different story. The kid told me she had cried during questioning, not out of sorrow but out of fear. Fear of losing freedom, fear of losing access, fear of facing a world that demanded accountability after a lifetime of slipping through cracks. I didn't know what to feel when I heard that. Anger would have been easier, but something deeper pressed inside me, something like mourning but without the softness that usually comes with grief. The old man didn't ask to visit her, didn't ask to send a message, didn't ask for updates beyond what he needed to understand the legal steps. He simply said, "We protect what matters," and sometimes protecting what matters means cutting away what hurts, even when it carries your blood. The hearing approached faster than I expected, and on the morning of it, I helped the old man dress in the suit he kept for weddings, funerals, harvest events, the fabric worn at the cuffs from years of shaking hands and signing papers and lifting glasses in celebration. He looked at himself in the mirror for a long time, and for a moment I saw something in his reflection, a mixture of strength and sorrow, the kind that comes from surviving those who were supposed to stand beside you. We drove in silence, the road winding through vineyards that lay bare for winter, their branches stripped clean but full of promise. The courthouse stood quiet under a sky washed with pale January light, and when we stepped inside, the air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves had heard too many confessions, too many lies, too many truths, spoken too late. She was already there, sitting stiffly beside her lawyer, avoiding our eyes, staring at the table, as if looking anywhere else would break something fragile inside her. I expected her to look older, thinner, worn down by the days since her arrest, but she looked almost the same except for the tension in her mouth, the tight grip she kept on her own hands, the way her shoulders curved inward, like someone shrinking away from the consequences she had built with her own decisions. When she finally glanced up, her eyes met mine for a split second, and something flickered there, something like recognition mixed with disbelief, as if she still expected me to stand beside her, to defend her, to protect her the way family is often expected to do, no matter the wound. But I didn't. I stayed beside the old man, feeling his breath steady beside me, and when the proceedings began, the truth laid itself out slowly, methodically, without anger, but with a precision that left no room for denial. The recording played. The forged documents passed from hand to hand. The financial trails, the medical lies, the sedatives, the attempted sale, all arranged in a sequence that made the truth unmistakable. She avoided looking at us through most of it. When the old man was asked if he wished to speak, he stepped forward slowly, gripping the edge of the podium, as if steadying the weight of years. His voice, when he spoke, carried a quiet firmness that filled the room without rising. He said he had loved her deeply once, that he had believed the best in her, that he had hoped time would soften whatever hardness life had carved into her. He said betrayal from strangers is painful, but betrayal from blood is a wound that reaches a place nothing else touches. He said he did not want revenge, he wanted truth, truth acknowledged, truth accepted, truth, witnessed by those with the power to keep her from hurting him again. When he finished, the room held a silence that felt almost sacred, and for a moment I saw something shift in her face, a tremor in her jaw, a flicker in her eyes, like someone trying not to drown in their own choices. But it passed quickly, swallowed by the heaviness she had wrapped around herself. The judge read the verdict, and the words fell into place like stones dropped into deep water, and though none of us reacted outwardly, something inside me changed at the sound of them. Not relief, not triumph, something quieter, something like finality. When they led her away, she looked at me again, this time longer, as if searching for something in my face, forgiveness, blame, recognition, but I gave her nothing. Some things break too completely to be repaired. We left the courthouse without speaking, the old man, leaning slightly on my arm but walking with a steadiness that told me the truth had given him back something he had lost during those drug-fogged months. The kid hugged him outside the building, promising to handle the remaining paperwork, and the old man smiled, tired but real. On the drive back, the sky began to clear, and sunlight broke through in slow, warm beams, touching the vines in a way that made the land look gentler, softer, as if the world had decided it had room for healing again. When we reached the house, the old man stepped out slowly, inhaling the cold air, then looked toward the vineyard, long rows stretching into morning light. He said the vines would need pruning soon. That winter was the time for cutting back, removing what no longer fed growth, making room for new life. I knew he wasn't talking only about grapes. Inside the house, I made coffee. The old man sat in his usual chair, and for the first time since arriving, I felt the walls relax the way a house does when danger has passed, finally letting its breath go. He looked at me after a long, quiet minute and said he didn't want the land to be a memory locked behind fear. He wanted it alive. He wanted me to help him keep it alive. I told him I would, not out of duty, out of choice, out of loyalty, out of the understanding that family is not the blood that betrays you, but the hand that remains steady when everything else falls apart. Months passed slowly, then quickly, depending on the day. Spring approached, pruning began, the kid visited, often bringing his children, who ran between the vines, laughing the way I once had. The old man taught them how to touch the branches gently, how to recognize a vine ready to bear fruit, how to trust what grows slowly. Every evening we sat on the porch, glasses in hand, watching the sun fade behind the rows, and I realized healing doesn't return all at once. It comes like light slipping through clouds, piece by piece, until one day you feel it fully without noticing when it started. She will leave prison someday. That truth lingers in the back of my mind like a distant storm, no longer immediate but never forgotten. But she will not return here. The old man rewrote the trust, the kid secured the legal protections, and the land now belongs to those who chose to protect it, not those who saw it as currency. Sometimes I walk the vineyard alone in late evening, the air cool, the quiet, deep, and I think about how close we came to losing everything, not just property but the threads that tie generations together. I think about how betrayal can hollow a family from the inside, and how truth can rebuild what seemed already gone. I think about the old man's strength, the kid's vigilance, and the way this land holds memory and pain and resilience in equal measure. And each time I reach the far end of the vines, I turn back toward the house, where warm light spills from the windows, and I know this is what remains, after the fire, after the lies, after the reckoning. What remains is what was worth fighting for. What remains is ours, forever.